October 1943. High above the German countryside, Leutnant Hansvik squinted through his Messed Bf-109's canopy at an unfamiliar silhouette cutting through the morning sky. The aircraft below looked wrong, too sleek, too clean, with an odd bubble canopy that seemed almost American in design. But that was impossible. American fighters couldn't reach this deep into the Reich. They simply didn't have the range. Vic rolled his fighter into a diving attack, confident in what would be another easy victory against the lumbering American bombers and their inadequate escorts. What happened next would shatter everything the Luftwaffe thought they knew about air combat over Europe. The strange aircraft below suddenly accelerated with a burst of speed that left Vic's messmate struggling to keep pace. Then it turned, not the wide, sluggish turn of a typical American fighter, but a tight, vicious spiral that brought 650 caliber machine guns to bear on the German pilot's position. In the space of 3 seconds, Hans Vika went from predator to prey, and his world exploded in a storm of American lead. This was the P-51 Mustang's debut over occupied Europe, and it would change the course of the war in ways that neither side could have imagined. To understand how a single aircraft could transform the entire strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, we need to step back to 1940, when the war in the air was going very differently for the Allies. The Royal Air Force had just survived the Battle of Britain by the narrowest of margins. Their Spitfires and Hurricanes had proven they could match the Luftwaffe's best fighters over British soil, but they lacked one crucial capability: range. When the RAF tried to escort bombers deep into German territory, their fighters would run out of fuel and have to turn back, leaving the bombers defenseless against swarms of German interceptors. Across the Atlantic, the United States Army Air Forces faced the same fundamental problem. American strategists believed that massive formations of heavily armed bombers, flying fortresses, and liberators bristling with machine guns could fight their way to targets deep in Germany without fighter escort. They called it self-escorting bombing, and it was based on a catastrophic miscalculation. The Germans, meanwhile, had spent years perfecting their defensive tactics. Luftwaffe pilots like Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, and Gar Rahl had developed devastating head-on attacks that could shred bomber formations before the Americans could bring their defensive firepower to bear. German fighter pilots spoke with casual confidence about the turkey shoots that awaited any American bombers foolish enough to venture beyond the range of Allied fighters. By late 1943, the statistics told a grim story. American bomber losses over Germany were approaching unsustainable levels, sometimes 20, 30, even 40 aircraft lost in a single mission. Each bomber carried 10 crew members. The mathematics of attrition were working inexorably in Germany's favor. But in the design offices of North American aviation in California, a revolution was taking shape. It began not as a weapon of war, but as a business proposition. The story of the P-51 Mustang starts with an urgent phone call in April 1940. Sir Henry Self, head of the British Purchasing Commission, was desperately trying to buy American fighters for the RAF. Britain was fighting for its life, and they needed aircraft, any aircraft that could match the performance of German fighters. North American aviation had never built a fighter before. They were known for trainers and light bombers, not the high-performance interceptors that modern air warfare demanded. When the British approached them about building Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license, North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, made a bold counteroffer. "Give us 120 days, and we'll design you something better." What emerged from those frantic 4 months was unlike any fighter aircraft the world had ever seen. The Mustang's fuselage was sculpted with an almost artistic attention to aerodynamic efficiency. Its laminar flow-wing design reduced drag to levels that seemed impossible. Most remarkably, it was designed around a massive internal fuel capacity that would eventually give it the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But there was a problem. The early Mustangs were powered by Allison Fize's 1710 engines that performed poorly at high altitude, exactly where the air war over Europe was being fought. The RAF used their Mustangs for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions, where they performed admirably. But as fighters capable of taking on the Luftwaffe's best at 25,000 feet, the early Mustang was a disappointment. German intelligence reports from this period make for fascinating reading. Luftwaffe analysts correctly identified the Mustang's exceptional range and speed at low altitude, but dismissed it as a threat to their high-altitude interceptors. One report filed in early 1943 concluded that the Mustang was suitable only for ground attack missions and posed no significant threat to Reich air defenses. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The transformation of the P-51 from a promising but flawed design into the war's most effective long-range fighter came through an almost accidental marriage of British and American engineering. Rolls-Royce had developed the Merlin engine that powered the legendary Spitfire and Hurricane. When Packard Motor Company began building Merlins under license in Detroit, someone had the inspired idea of mating the supercharged Merlin with the Mustang's exceptional airframe. The results were nothing short of revolutionary. The Merlin-powered P-51B and P-51D variants could climb to 40,000 feet and cruise at speeds that left German fighters struggling to intercept them. More importantly, they could do this while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers on missions lasting 8 hours or more. Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flew one of the first Merlin-powered Mustangs in October 1942. His report to the Air Ministry was almost breathless with excitement. "The performance is phenomenal. This aircraft has the range to escort bombers to any target in Germany, and the performance to outfight anything the Luftwaffe can put against it." But performance on paper was one thing. Combat over occupied Europe would be quite another. The P-51B Mustang made its combat debut with the 8th Air Force in December 1943. The 354th Fighter Group, based at Boxted in England, received the first operational Mustangs, and their pilots approached the new aircraft with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Captain Don Blakesley, an experienced pilot who had flown Spitfires with the RAF before transferring to the American forces, was among the first to take the Mustang into combat. His initial impression was telling. It's fast, it's got range, and it's got firepower. But can it turn with a 109? Can it climb with a 190? We're about to find out. The answer came on December 1st, 1943, during a mission to escort B-17 flying fortresses attacking aircraft factories in Solingen. As the formation crossed into German airspace, Luftwaffe controllers scrambled interceptors from bases across western Germany. Among them was Hayman Klaus Mittusch, a veteran pilot with over 30 victories who was flying a FW-190. Mittusch later described his first encounter with a Mustang in a letter to his wife. "I saw this aircraft below us and thought it was another Thunderbolt, big, heavy, probably slow in a turn. I rolled down on him, expecting an easy kill. Instead, he accelerated away from me like I was standing still, then came around in a turn so tight I couldn't believe it. Before I knew what was happening, he was on my tail, and I was running for my life." That first mission saw 3 German fighters shot down by Mustangs with no American losses. But more importantly, it demonstrated something that would fundamentally alter the strategic bombing campaign. American fighters could now reach any target in Germany. German fighter pilots had grown accustomed to a predictable rhythm in their defensive missions. American bombers would appear over the Reich, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts or P-38 Lightnings that would eventually reach their fuel limits and turn back. Then came the happy time. Unescorted bombers vulnerable to concentrated attacks by German fighters operating from their home bases. The Mustang shattered this comfortable routine. Suddenly, German pilots found themselves facing fresh American fighters over targets deep in the Reich. Fighters that seemed to have unlimited endurance and performance that matched or exceeded their own aircraft. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most experienced fighter commanders, wrote in his diary after encountering Mustangs for the first time, "These American fighters are unlike anything we have faced before. They appear over our most distant targets with full fuel and ammunition, ready to fight. Our pilots are reporting that the Mustangs can outrun our 109s in level flight and outturn our 19s in sustained combat. This changes everything." The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and profound. Fighter pilots who had grown confident in their ability to intercept unescorted bombers now faced the prospect of extended dogfights against fresh, well-trained American pilots flying superior aircraft. The hunter was becoming the hunted. To understand the full impact of the Mustang's arrival, we need to examine what American bombers faced before adequate fighter escort became available. The second Schweinfurt raid of October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday and demonstrated the horrific cost of sending bombers deep into Germany without fighter protection. 291 B-17 flying fortresses took off from English bases that morning, targeting the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt that were crucial to German war production. The mission planners knew it would be costly. Schweinfurt was 400 miles from the nearest Allied fighter base, well beyond the range of any available escort fighter. What followed was a masterclass in German defensive tactics. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled over 300 fighters against the American formation, attacking in waves from the moment the bombers crossed into German airspace. German pilots had perfected the art of head-on attacks, diving through the bomber formations at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour, their cannon and machine guns ripping through aluminum and flesh. By the time the surviving bombers limped back to England, 60 flying fortresses had been shot down and another 138 damaged. 600 American airmen were dead, wounded, or missing. The 8th Air Force had lost more than 20% of its attacking force in a single day. Brigadier General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the bomber formations that day, was blunt in his assessment. We cannot continue to accept losses like this. Either we get long-range fighter escort, or we abandon daylight bombing altogether. The Germans, meanwhile, were jubilant. Luftwaffe pilots like Egon Meyer and Georg Peter Eder had perfected tactics that seemed to make American daylight bombing impossible. German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels proclaimed that the Reich's air defenses were impregnable. But even as German pilots celebrated their victory over Schweinfurt, the first P-51B Mustangs were arriving at English airfields. The aircraft that would turn the tide of the air war over Europe was about to enter combat. To understand the revolution the Mustang represented, we need to step inside the cockpit with the men who flew these missions. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group described his first flight in a P-51D. Everything about it felt different. The visibility was incredible. That bubble canopy let you see in every direction. The controls were light and responsive, but what really got your attention was the fuel gauge. We could fly for hours at combat power and still have fuel to fight. The psychological impact of this extended range cannot be overstated. American pilots who had grown used to watching their fuel gauges anxiously, knowing they would have to abandon the bombers they were supposed to protect, suddenly found themselves able to stay with their charges all the way to the target and back. Captain Chuck Yeager, who would later become famous as the first man to break the sound barrier, flew Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. His description of a typical escort mission reveals the new reality of air combat over Europe. We'd take off from England with enough fuel to fly to Berlin and back with fuel left over for 30 minutes of combat. The Germans couldn't believe it. They'd attack us over the target, expecting us to run low on fuel and head home. Instead, we'd stay and fight, and often we'd chase them back to their own airfields. This extended combat persistence fundamentally altered the mathematics of air warfare. German pilots operating from their home bases had always enjoyed the advantage of being able to break off combat and land at nearby airfields when low on fuel or ammunition. Suddenly, they found themselves facing American fighters that could pursue them relentlessly, turning the familiar geography of the Reich into a hunting ground for Allied pilots. The P-51's revolutionary performance came from a combination of innovative design features that, taken together, created an aircraft unlike anything that had come before. The laminar flow wing, developed by North American engineers, reduced drag by maintaining smooth airflow over a greater portion of the wing surface. This seemingly minor improvement translated into dramatically increased speed and range. The aircraft's internal fuel capacity was equally revolutionary. Where earlier fighters carried perhaps 200 to 300 gallons of fuel, the P-51D could carry over 400 gallons internally, plus additional fuel in external drop tanks. This gave the Mustang a combat radius of over 750 miles, enough to escort bombers to any target in Germany and engage in extended combat over the target area. But, perhaps most importantly, the Mustang's .650 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute, creating a cone of destruction that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds. American pilots described the effect of a concentrated burst from all 6 guns as like hitting them with a sledgehammer. German pilots who survived encounters with Mustangs consistently reported being shocked by the aircraft's firepower. Lieutenant Franz Stiegler, who would later become famous for his chivalrous treatment of a damaged American bomber, described his first combat with a Mustang. "I thought I had him lined up for an easy shot, but he turned into me and opened fire. The tracers looked like a solid stream of light. I have never seen such concentrated firepower from a single-engine fighter." By early 1944, the impact of the Mustang's arrival was becoming clear in the statistics of air combat over Europe. German fighter losses were climbing steadily, while American bomber losses were dropping dramatically. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies over the Reich for years, was suddenly fighting for its life. The transformation was most visible in the changing tactics of both sides. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to making multiple attacks on unescorted bomber formations, now found themselves forced into single, desperate passes before being engaged by swarms of Mustangs. The leisurely, methodical destruction of American bomber formations was becoming a thing of the past. American bomber crews, meanwhile, were reporting a dramatic change in their combat experience. Sergeant Bill Fleming, a ball turret gunner on a B-17, described the difference. "Before the Mustangs showed up, we knew that once we crossed into Germany, we were on our own. The fighters would have to turn back, and then it was just us against every German fighter in the sky. But with the 51s along, it was different. They'd stay with us all the way to the target and all the way home. You could see the German fighters out there, but they couldn't get through the Mustangs to reach us." The psychological impact on German pilots was equally profound. Hauptmann Hansi Koch, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot, wrote in his diary, "The Americans now have fighters that can reach any target in Germany. Our pilots are reporting that these Mustangs are faster than our 109s, more maneuverable than our 19s, and they seem to have unlimited fuel. How are we supposed to defend the Reich against this?" As 1944 progressed, the answer to Koch's question was becoming increasingly clear. They couldn't. The stage was now set for the decisive air battles of 1944. The Luftwaffe, despite its growing disadvantages, still possessed experienced pilots and advanced aircraft. German engineers were working frantically on revolutionary jet fighters that promised to restore air superiority to the Reich. The Me-262, with its incredible speed advantage, seemed to offer hope that German air power could once again dominate European skies. But the Mustang had already begun to tip the balance of air power decisively in favor of the Allies. American production lines were turning out hundreds of P-50s each month, while German aircraft production struggled under the constant bombardment that Mustang-escorted bombers were now able to deliver with devastating precision. The mathematics of attrition, which had once favored the Germans, were now working inexorably against them. Every German pilot shot down was irreplaceable. Every German aircraft destroyed took months to replace. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs were producing thousands of new aviators, and American factories were delivering aircraft faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. As the spring of 1944 approached, both sides prepared for what would become the decisive air campaign of the European War. The Luftwaffe would make one final, desperate attempt to regain control of German skies. The Mustang pilots of the 8th and 15th Air Forces would be waiting for them. The stage was set for an aerial slaughter that would break the back of German air power forever. February 20th, 1944. The alarm bells at Luftwaffe airfields across Germany began ringing at dawn. American radar operators in England had detected the largest bomber formation ever assembled. Over 1,000 B-17s and B-24s heading for aircraft factories deep in the Reich. But this time, something was different. Instead of the usual handful of short-range escorts that would turn back at the German border, the radar screens showed an unprecedented sight. Hundreds of P-51 Mustangs flying alongside the bombers, their distinctive signatures clear even at maximum range. This was the beginning of Big Week, 6 days of sustained air combat that would determine the fate of German air power. For the Luftwaffe, it represented their last chance to break the back of American daylight bombing. For the Mustang pilots of the 8th Air Force, it would be their baptism by fire against the full might of German fighter defenses. Oberst Hans von Trotthoft, commanding German fighters in Defense Sector West, stared at the plotting board in disbelief. "They have fighters over Magdeburg," he told his staff. "Magdeburg is 400 kilometers from the nearest Allied base. How is this possible?" The answer was flying at 25,000 feet above the German countryside, where Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley was leading the 4th Fighter Group's Mustangs deeper into Germany than any Allied fighters had ever flown. Blakesley's radio crackled with reports from his pilots. "Bandits 2 o'clock high. I've got 319s coming in from the sun." Splash 109. The air war over Europe was about to change forever. The first day of Big Week saw German controllers throw everything they had at the American formations. Over 400 Luftwaffe fighters ascended to confront the incoming forces, their pilots confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the American escorts. What transpired was a slaughter, though not the one the Germans had anticipated. Major George Prey, a pilot with the 352nd Fighter Group, chronicled the engagement in his combat report. "We were ambushed by approximately 2,919 aircraft over Brunswick. They advanced with speed and aggression, likely expecting us to be low on fuel as the Thunderbolts often were. Instead, we met them head-on with full tanks and considerable fighting spirit. In the subsequent 10 minutes, we downed 8 of their planes without losing a single Mustang. The German aviators were experiencing something entirely novel, sustained aerial conflict against fresh American fighters operating at peak performance deep within German territory." Lord Heinz Kenoy, piloting his Bf-109G over central Germany, later penned, "The Mustangs seemed to be ubiquitous. Every attempt we made to assault the bombers was met with their interception, and they simply wouldn't disengage. We would battle them for 20 minutes, break off to refuel, and find them still present upon our return." By the close of the inaugural day, German casualties were catastrophic. 42 Luftwaffe fighters had been shot down, with many more sustaining damage. American losses were negligible, with only 4 Mustangs lost in aerial combat. The kill ratio that would define the remainder of the air war over Europe was already becoming evident. Beneath the cold statistics lay narratives of extraordinary bravery and devastating loss. Shaman Georg, Peter Ed, one of the pilots, found himself embroiled in a protracted engagement with Mustangs over his home airfield at Bad Varischhofen. In a missive to his sister, penned that evening, he conveyed the desperation of the German situation. "Today, I engaged American fighters over our very own base. They pursued us home, Maria. They possess sufficient fuel to chase us to our own airfields, and still retain ammunition to strafe us on the ground. I have been flying fighters for 4 years, and I have never witnessed anything comparable. The Americans are not merely winning, they are hunting us." On the American side, the psychological impact was equally profound, albeit entirely dissimilar. Captain Chuck Jagger, flying his Mustang, Glamorous Glen over Germany, described the sensation of air superiority. "For the first time since we commenced flying over Germany, we felt like the hunters rather than the prey. We possessed the range to remain with the bombers, the performance to outmaneuver any opposition they presented, and the firepower to complete the mission. Yet, the human toll was palpable on both sides. Technical Sergeant Mike Gladys, a Polish aviator serving with the American 56th Fighter Group, downed 3 German fighters in a singular encounter, but witnessed his wingman's Mustang disintegrate under cannon fire from a full Wolf 190. "Victory and loss," he inscribed in his journal that night. "They intertwine in this conflict. One celebrates the vanquishing of the adversary, then mourns the comrade who will not return. As conventional German fighters proved increasingly incapable of countering the Mustang threat, Luftwaffe commanders turned to their most sophisticated weaponry, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet. These revolutionary aircraft promised performance that could finally rival or surpass the Mustang's capabilities. The Me-262, with its twin jet engines, could achieve speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than any propeller-driven fighter. When piloted by experienced aviators such as Major Walter Nowotny or Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, the jet fighter appeared to offer hope that German air power could reclaim the initiative. However, the jets brought their own set of challenges. They required immense quantities of fuel, possessed limited endurance, and were vulnerable during takeoff and landing when their speed advantage dissipated. Most critically, Germany was depleting its supply of experienced pilots to fly them. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group became one of the initial Allied pilots to bring down a jet aircraft when he intercepted an Me-262 during its landing approach. His combat report illuminated the tactical reality. The Jerry jet was incredibly swift in level flight, but when it decelerated for landing, it became just another target. I positioned myself behind it on final approach and delivered a burst from approximately 200 yards. It plummeted directly into the ground. The rocket-powered Me-163 was even more problematic. While it could ascend to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes and attain speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, it carried fuel for only 8 minutes of powered flight. Worse still, the aircraft's volatile rocket propellant was so perilous that it claimed more German pilots' lives than enemy action. By the spring of 1944, Mustang groups had devised tactics specifically engineered to dismantle the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter strength. Rather than simply providing escort for bombers, P-51 units commenced conducting fighter sweeps, offensive sorties designed to seek out and eradicate German aircraft wherever they could be found. Colonel Hubert Zakaw, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, pioneered many of these strategies. His pilots would arrive over German airfields precisely as enemy fighters were taking off or landing, catching them at their most vulnerable junctures. "We are no longer merely safeguarding our bombers," Zeka exhorted his pilots. "We are actively hunting down every German fighter we can locate." The repercussions were devastating for the Luftwaffe. German pilot training programs, already curtailed due to fuel scarcity, began producing inexperienced aviators who were easy prey for veteran American pilots. Oberst Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most renowned fighter aces, later remarked, "By mid-1944, we were deploying boys into combat against seasoned men. Our new pilots had perhaps 50 hours of flight training, while the Americans they encountered had 300 hours or more. It was not combat. It was a massacre. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity." In January of 1944, the Luftwaffe possessed over 2,400 operational fighters. By June, that number had dwindled to fewer than 1,500, despite ongoing production. The reason was straightforward. German fighters were being shot down at a faster rate than they could be replaced, and experienced pilots were becoming extinct. Major John T. Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group emerged as one of the war's leading aces, flying the Mustang with 16 confirmed victories. His account of a mission over Berlin in March 1944 encapsulates the transformation of aerial warfare over Europe. "We were escorting B-17 bombers to the big city when approximately 39 and 190 aircraft ambushed us over the target. 2 years prior, this would have been a disaster. We would have been low on fuel, outnumbered, and engaged in combat over enemy territory. But in the Mustang, everything was different. We had abundant fuel, our aircraft were swifter than theirs, and we had trained specifically for this type of engagement. Within 20 minutes, we downed 8 of them and dispersed the remainder. The bombers completed their mission without a single aircraft lost to enemy fighters. On the German side, the accounts grew increasingly desperate. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, who would later gain renown for his chivalrous escort of a damaged B-17, described the hopelessness of the German predicament. "We would take off with perhaps 8 or 10 aircraft. The Americans would meet us with 40 or 50 Mustangs. Our orders were to attack the bombers, but we could never penetrate the fighter screen. By the time we landed, if we landed at all, half our formation would be gone." The psychological toll on German pilots was immense. Many began to exhibit symptoms of what would later be recognized as combat fatigue, but which German commanders dismissed as cowardice. Hartmann Heinzke wrote in his diary, "I have completed 400 combat missions. I have downed 33 enemy aircraft, but I am afraid now not of dying. That acceptance came long ago. I fear helplessness. The Americans possess fighters that can go anywhere, do anything. We are no longer warriors. We are victims." The fatal blow to German air power occurred during the spring and summer of 1944, as Mustang-equipped fighter groups initiated systematic assaults on German airfields, training installations, and aircraft factories. Operation Argument, the official designation for the campaign against German aircraft production, saw American fighters ranging across the Reich in pursuit of targets. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group led one of the most successful of these missions, a low-level attack on an airfield near Munich. His after-action report details the methodical destruction. We descended to treetop level and caught them entirely by surprise. Approximately 40 aircraft were on the ground, trainers, fighters, even a few jets. We executed 4 passes, strafing everything that moved. When we departed, the field was engulfed in smoke and burning aircraft. It resembled a junkyard. These ground assaults were particularly devastating, as they annihilated not only aircraft, but also the infrastructure essential for training new pilots. Flight training schools, fuel depots, and maintenance facilities all became targets for roving Mustangs. The Luftwaffe found itself incapable of replacing its losses or effectively training new aviators. General Adolf Galland, commander of the German fighter force, issued increasingly desperate pleas to Hitler for resources and pragmatic tactics. In one meeting documented by his aide, Galland informed the Führer, "We are losing the air war not because our aircraft are inferior, but because we cannot train pilots fast enough to replace our losses. The Americans are shooting down our experienced pilots faster than we can create new ones." Hitler's response was characteristic. He blamed the pilots rather than confront the strategic reality. "German pilots lack fighting spirit," he declared. "They must be ordered to ram enemy aircraft if necessary." Such directives only hastened the demise of what remained of German air power. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the transformation was complete. The Luftwaffe managed to conduct a mere 319 sorties over the Normandy beaches against more than 14,000 Allied sorties. German fighters were so scarce that many Allied pilots completing their tours of duty never encountered an enemy aircraft. The kill ratios illustrate the situation with mathematical precision. In 1943, prior to the Mustang's introduction, German and American fighter losses were approximately equal. By 1944, American pilots were downing German fighters at a ratio nearing 4-1. In certain engagements, the ratio escalated to 10-1 or higher. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meare of the 352nd Fighter Group, who would conclude the war with 24 victories, described the prevailing circumstances. By late 1944, encountering German fighters was actually uncommon. When we did locate them, they were typically inexperienced pilots flying in small formations. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe in 1940 simply no longer existed. The human cost was staggering. The Luftwaffe sustained over 13,000 pilot fatalities in action during 1944 alone, exceeding the total from the preceding 3 years combined. Among the fallen were many of Germany's most accomplished aces, individuals like Hamann Hans Joachim Marseille and Major Helmut Wick, whose loss was irreparable. The P-51 Mustang's influence on World War II extended far beyond mere aerial combat statistics. By achieving air superiority over Europe, Mustang pilots facilitated the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German war production. Without the incessant threat of fighter attack, American and British bombers could engage targets with devastating accuracy. The psychological impact was equally significant. German civilians, who had been assured that the Reich's air defenses were impregnable, watched helplessly as Allied aircraft appeared over their cities in broad daylight. The myth of German invincibility, meticulously crafted by Nazi propaganda, crumbled beneath the contrails of American bombers escorted by Mustangs. For the men who flew the Mustang, the aircraft represented more than just superior technology. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions without being shot down, reflected later, "The P-51 did not merely provide us with enhanced performance, it instilled confidence. We knew we were flying the finest fighter in the world, and that knowledge elevated our piloting capabilities." The German perspective was inevitably divergent. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who survived the war to become a general in the post-war German Air Force, wrote, "The Mustang was the aircraft that broke our spirit, not solely because it was vastly superior to our fighters, though it was, but because it could penetrate any part of Germany and remain there to engage. It transformed our homeland into a hunting ground for American pilots." When the war concluded in May of 1945, the statistics of the air war depicted a complete transformation. The Luftwaffe, which had commenced the war as the world's most advanced air force, had been reduced to a mere handful of aircraft concealed in forests and caves. German pilot training had virtually ceased, and fuel shortages meant that even experienced pilots rarely took to the skies. The P-51 Mustang groups, conversely, had amassed a record of achievement unparalleled in aviation history. The 4th Fighter Group alone was credited with over 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. The 352nd Fighter Group produced more aces than any other American unit. Collectively, Mustang pilots were credited with destroying over 4,500 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, representing more than half of all German aircraft downed by American fighters. Yet, beyond the numbers lay a more profound metamorphosis. The Mustang had demonstrated that technological superiority, when applied judiciously, could overcome numerical disadvantages and geographical barriers. It proved that air power, decisively achieved, could decisively influence the outcome of an entire conflict. The narrative of the P-51 Mustang and its impact on World War II is ultimately a chronicle of the convergence of technology, strategy, and human valor. The aircraft itself was extraordinary, a synthesis of American industrial might and engineering ingenuity that yielded performance levels previously deemed unattainable. However, technology alone did not secure victory in the air war over Europe. It was achieved by young men, many barely past their teenage years, who ascended into single-seat fighters and ventured deep into enemy territory to engage in mortal combat. Men such as Chuck Jagger, George Prey, and Don Gentile, who combined exceptional skill with extraordinary bravery to attain air superiority over the most heavily fortified airspace globally. The German pilots they confronted were equally courageous, equally proficient, and often piloting aircraft that possessed superior performance in specific areas. Nevertheless, they were engaged in a losing struggle against the sheer mathematics of industrial warfare. America's capacity to manufacture aircraft, train pilots, and sustain operations across intercontinental distances ultimately proved decisive. The P-51 Mustang became the instrument of that triumph. But it was the men who piloted it who ultimately achieved it. In the end, the air war over Europe was won not by machines, but by the courage and skill of the pilots who flew them into combat day after day, until the enemy could no longer ascend to meet them. When German pilots first encountered the P-51 Mustang in late 1943, many dismissed it as just another American fighter, perhaps fast, but nothing they couldn't handle. By 1945, those same pilots, if they had survived, knew better. The Mustang had not merely vanquished the Luftwaffe, it had rendered their defeat inevitable. The laughter had long since subsided, replaced by the silence of vacant airfields, and the lingering echoes of a once formidable air force that had been systematically annihilated by American pilots flying the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. The P-51 Mustang had penned the concluding chapter in the saga of German air power, and that chapter was entitled Defeat.